Good afternoon. My name is John Gaswright, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this edition of the Project 2049 Strategic Competition webinar series. The events of recent years have dramatically shifted the fundamentals of the U.S. China relationship. Recent developments such as Beijing's COVID-19 cover-up, concentration camps in Xinjiang, crushing Hong Kong's promised freedoms, threats against Taiwan, not to mention the U.S. Speaker of the House, have forced new realities on the international community, straining the liberal world order and demanding a reaction from the United States and its alliance network. Where we are now and how the United States can work with Japan and other allies and partners to be competitive in preserving our shared values are critical questions to explore. The economic arena is particularly important theater where the United States and our allies must compete. The China Economic and Strategy Initiative, or CeCe, is a new nonprofit organization within Project 2049 led by a commission of foreign policy and national security experts committed to helping the United States compete against China. CeCe's core mission is to provide U.S. policymakers the knowledge necessary to develop and execute a strategy to compete with and win against China. Importantly, competing with China in the economic arena will be a core focus of CeCe. Today, we look forward to learning more about this challenge, potential solutions, and the role that the China Economic Strategy Initiative is going to play. Before we do that, and before I turn this over to my colleague Jin Hong, let me share the best way for our viewing audience to participate in today's live Q&A session. First, you can send questions directly to us at ask@project2049.net. That's ask@project2049.net. If you RSVP'd for the event, we sent an event reminder from that email just moments ago, and you can respond directly to that email with your questions. Second, if you have a YouTube account and are watching this stream on Project 2049's YouTube channel, you can submit questions in the YouTube chat box, and our team will collect them and send them to the moderator. Please include your name and affiliation when submitting questions. Questions with names and affiliations are prioritized. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to my Project 2049 colleague, Jin Hong. Jin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. My name is Jennifer Hong. I'm the Senior Director with Project 2049, and it's my honor to moderate this discussion on a turning point in competition with China. We have three distinguished speakers with us today, and I will start with Shioko Goto, who is the Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director for the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. Her research focuses on the economics and politics of Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, as well as U.S. policy in Northeast Asia. She is a seasoned journalist and analyst, and she has reported from Tokyo and Washington for Dow Jones and UPI on the global economy, international trade, and Asian markets. She's also a columnist for the Diplomat magazine and a contributing editor to the Globalist. And she was previously a donor country relations officer for the World Bank and has been awarded fellowships from the East-West Center and the Knight Foundation, among many others. It's a pleasure to have you today. After Shioko sets the stage for us, I'm going to turn it over to two other speakers, Honorable Randall G. Schriver, who is the chairman of the board at the Project 2049 Institute and the chairman of the newly established China Economic and Strategy Initiative, CeCe, and a partner at Pacific Solutions. Most recently, Mr. Schriver served 2 years as the Assistant Secretary for Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, and prior to his confirmation as the Assistant Secretary, he was a founding partner of Armitage International LLC, a consulting firm that specializes in international business development and strategies. Mr. Schriver has an outstanding career of service to the United States, including service as a U.S. naval officer and several key leadership roles in both the State Department and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And Mr. Blumenthal is a senior fellow and a director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on East Asian security issues and Sino-American relations. He is also the partner at Pacific Solutions, and we are thrilled that he has joined the new CeCe as the vice chairman. Mr. Blumenthal has served in and advised the U.S. government on China issues for more than a decade. And before joining AEI, he has served as Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the U.S. Department of Defense. He has also served as a commissioner on the congressionally mandated U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission from 2006 to 2012, and he was the vice chairman of the commission in 2007. He has served as on the academic advisory board on the Congressional U.S. China Working Group, and he is the author of The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State, and co-author of An Awkward Embrace, The United States and China in the 21st Century. With that introduction, Shihoko, I want to turn it over to you to kick us off and set the stage by sharing your observation of the state of affairs in the economic security in the Indo-Pacific region. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. It is a tremendous honor and great pleasure for me to share the platform with you, Chairman Schriver, now Vice Chairman Blumenthal. Congratulations to Project 2049 for launching this new initiative to focus on U.S. competition with China through the prism of economic interests. Since China took over Japan as the world's second largest economy in 2010, not only has its influence in the global economy continued to expand, despite repeated assertions from many quarters that the Chinese economy's rise cannot be sustainable. In fact, despite its many flaws and fragilities, China's economic influence worldwide has actually only continued to rise, especially in the global south. Beijing is also increasingly leveraging its economic might for political influence worldwide at the state, corporate, and individual level. From South Korean companies facing the wrath of China after Seoul's decision to deploy THAAD on Korean soil, to Australia engaging in a de facto full-on trade war with China as a result of Canberra calling for an investigation into the origins of COVID, Beijing has not shied away from using its economic dominance in the global economy for its own gain. Steps to decrease dependence on China, from enhancing domestic capabilities, reassessing supply chain resilience, to working more closely with like-minded nations, they are all taking place through new trade pacts, new partnerships. And the United States has also embarked to double down on its own commitment to strengthen its own domestic capabilities, especially in the critical technology sectors. And these are certainly ways to fight back against Chinese economic coercion and decrease dependence on a country with a value system that is increasingly polarizing from the United States. But the uncomfortable truth is that there's no end in sight for Beijing to stop weaponizing its economic dominance and to take advantage of the global interdependence that, because quite frankly, it's been able to, and because it's been very effective for Beijing thus far. So it's not enough simply to develop a strategy to push back against Chinese coercion or to boost domestic industrial capabilities within the United States. And just as Beijing is upping the ante in its economic statecraft, ranging from reshaping development assistance goals through the Belt and Road Initiative to advancing its dual circulation strategy to beef up internal resilience and external dependence on China at the same time, Washington too must have a more comprehensive approach to economic security in light of competing with China, not just economically, but also militarily and even politically as well. So not only should the United States' own trade objectives be more clearly defined to enhance America's competitiveness, but why and how compatibility with the economies of like-minded partners is needed must also be made clear. And perhaps most importantly, there is a growing need to protect strategic economic assets of the world economy collectively and develop mechanisms, perhaps an economic security alliance of sorts, by which threats to the collective economic interests trigger collective economic action, from the flow of capital and the flow of goods and the exchange of people. So we're still at the cusp, really at the beginning of defining and promoting economic security in confronting the China challenge. And as the Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise at the Wilson Center, I'm very much looking forward to learning from and collaborating with my colleagues at Project 2049's new China Economic and Strategy Initiative. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for setting that stage for us. We will go into a moderated discussion where I will ask several questions to Randy and Dan. And at this time, we welcome all of you who are tuning in to send in your questions, as John mentioned, at ask@project2049.net and on YouTube live channel. Just participate by sending us your questions, your name, and your affiliation. So with that, Randy, I'm going to turn it over to you first. What Shiyoko said was this is just the beginning of economic security, just for us to all the nations to think about how to face the Beijing challenge, the economic dominance that it's attempting day in and day out. Could you elaborate a little bit more on just over the few years how the nations are approaching China and why that is happening? Just a little bit more depth to the CCP and China's actions.
Great. Well, thanks, Jen. Thanks for the question, and certainly enjoyed Ms. Goto's remarks. Thank you for helping set the stage for us. I think the biggest difference is that most countries recognize the challenge and the problem. There's greater consensus on what we all face. China, for a long time, manipulated our support and participation in a free and open economic order for their own benefit. And slowly but surely, many countries were coming to the view that they were not going to be a responsible stakeholder. But certainly events over the last few years, as implied in your question, Jen, have helped to accelerate the level of concern and anxiety about China and what kind of partner China can be in the economic space, how certain countries might want to adapt their own policies. So recent events such as the COVID cover-up and the continuing zero COVID policies, which have dramatically altered the global trading system and the supply chain system, China's ongoing human rights atrocities, including the camps in Xinjiang and the ongoing repression of other ethnic minorities, the coercion of Taiwan, as we saw recently, the overreaction to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and of course also China's backing of Russia in its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. So I think all of those combine to act as an accelerant to everyone's level of concern. And now we're at a stage where we're trying to, as individual countries, adapt to these challenges, come up with appropriate policies, but also collectively share best practices, identify where collective action is necessary, and we can only succeed if we respond as like-minded countries. And so this is really a critical phase. Recognition of the problem is just step one. Now we're at a point where we're trying to come up with optimal policies to deal with it, and hopefully do that alongside friends and allies and partners who have like mind.
Thank you. Dan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, on that specific question, I would just say that there are a couple things that are going to be going forward a little bit different, I think. One is grappling with the fact that though the CCP has made great strides economically and continues to do so, and has created dependencies across the world, including by us on certain sources of supply that we saw during COVID and so forth that are very concerning to us. Its economy does seem to be in a long-term slowdown, and there are structural factors at work that I think Xi Jinping will not address for political reasons going into the Party Congress. So I think one of the challenges, and it's very difficult for I think Washington policymakers to get their head around some of these contradictions, which is It's not an economy that is going to overtake the United States. That's not the right frame. But it is going to be a very important economy going forward. It's going to be growing more slowly, but still very important. And it's going to be, we're going to have to take more of a scalpel approach, I think, going forward to what is it actually that poses the most problems to the United States and our allies. In the Chinese economy and in Chinese economic statecraft. And what is it? How do we grapple with the fact that the the picture of China being too weak is not correct, but also the picture of China overtaking the United States is also not correct. So I think there are a lot of conceptual challenges going forward in defining the problem, and then fashioning some, I think, very complicated responses.
Yes. I know you briefly touched upon US's response. How has the US adopted its policies, and do you think that we're doing enough in this space? You had mentioned more scalpel-like approach. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit more, Dan?
Yeah, I'd say a few things. One is the U.S. has obviously begun to take seriously the concept of Chinese economic aggression, as it was called in the previous administration, and in this administration, using the word malign influence and unfair practices. Certainly, I think the awareness of the American public is much higher about Chinese practices, whether they be distortions of various markets and semiconductors and so forth because of state subsidies or IP theft, of course, and massive IP theft, things of that nature, and of course the coercion that was mentioned previously, economic coercion towards Australia and so forth. So I think public awareness is much higher. In terms of actions, I mean, there's been some actions there's some actions, limited actions, I would say, with respect to entities listings, which lead to export controls. But the Wall Street Journal had a piece a few weeks ago that stated that essentially most technology is still flowing to China. So you can't really say that the United States or its allies have really taken, I'd say, strong steps to stem the tide of technologies we don't want to see in Chinese hands. So that has to be addressed both legislatively and through executive action. When we talk about rejiggering supply chains and not being dependent upon China for certain sources of supply, I would say, the whole concept in the United States of free trade agreements, market access agreements, has disappeared since the bipartisan faltering of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So I'm not an economist, but I can't really see how supply chains are really going to move without alternative markets, alternative places. So if you don't have free trade agreements, market access agreements, carefully crafted with Southeast Asia, for example, I just can't imagine this idea of even partial decoupling being successful.
Randy, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think Dan's answer is spot on. And I think as we grew to understand the nature of the challenge a little more and China's ambitions came into greater clarity, obviously people reached for the toolkit and the tools that were available. And so I think the end product of that is something that's a bit uneven, not necessarily coherent when it comes to understanding the interaction of these various tools. So what's the impact of tariffs versus reform CFIUS and the like? And I think one of the things that is missing is, really at a fundamental level, understanding strategic objectives, how these various tools should be employed. Some are underutilized, maybe some are overutilized, some maybe still need to be created by working with our Congress. But I think the response to date has been one that reflects what was available to policymakers at the time to impose costs. Certain cases try to deal with the most urgent problems, for example, on export controls, as we watched China's military civil fusion program grow their military in very sophisticated ways. But what we really hope to do is have a fundamental relook at the overall economic and trade strategy and how to strengthen that and optimize that.
Well, I think that is why the initiative CeCe, right, has come into its in conception, inception. What is CeCe? And why did you think that this was the right time? I mean, it seems like this is the right time. How did it come about? It tell us more about this initiative, Randy.
Well, thank you. Yes, it's very much based on what I just described as a need for a more thoughtful, coherent strategy based on underlying premises that can be agreed to, fundamental objectives. I believe to have a strategy, you have to have defined optimal end states. And so, very much relying on the intellectual property of Vice Chairman Dan Blumenthal and some others who we've worked with. We developed this idea, and CeCe is a standalone initiative under Project 2049, and as such enjoys a 501c3 status, so we're non-profit, nonpartisan. And it's an organization that is both comprised of and will be run by a set of senior commissioners. Happy to have Dan alongside in this effort, but we also have other tremendous colleagues, Matt Pottinger, Peter Berkowitz, Sheena Chestnut-Greitens, and Nazak Nikatar, just an all-star group that bring a wealth of experience in the national security field as well as the trade and economic field. And we've got a great staff. Josh Young has joined us as executive director, and we have a great research fellow, Madison Sparber. So we've got the team to do this and really help our policymakers understand the lay of the land, but more importantly, what should the fundamental strategic objectives be? How do we build out a roadmap? If we were going to look at a next administration first 100-day plan, what should that look like? What should they be asking the Congress for? What things can be done through executive order? This is too critical to just let inertia control our policy choices. This needs to be a very thoughtful, intentional approach to this economic competition.
Dan, I know you're the vice chairman. What made you want to be part of this initiative?
Well, as Randy said, we were working closely with some groups who are very interested in how to make a unique contribution to what is getting to be a fairly crowded field now with interest in China. And you'll notice Randy mentioned our colleagues. None except for one it really has much experience in trade and investment and economics. It's really for national security, foreign policy people to learn as much as they can about what actually matters from a strategic point of view in terms of the economic competition, in terms of economic policy, and so forth. And we hope to learn a lot, bring experts to bear to help us do so, and then to hopefully educate other strategists and national security policymakers. There's a debate raging about the issues of technology, of decoupling, words that are flying around, concepts that are flying around that I don't believe have been thought through fully from the perspective of national security policymakers, who at the end of the day, if you imagine a U.S. government, U.S. government now, let's say that has a China policy, and the Biden administration, let's say, or the Trump administration before it, has some serious thoughts and ideas about what to do economically, but really needs to know how the different agencies of the U.S. government who do economics, USTR, Commerce, Treasury, how to leverage them really better for competition. A lot of those agencies have been set up not for competition, but for export, helping U.S. export, helping U.S. open markets, and so on. Even the time spent, let's say, by a U.S. trade representative. I mean, in the last administration and this administration too, a lot of that time is spent negotiating bilaterally with China. It's our going in hypothesis and assumption that that's not time well spent when you have all these Southeast Asian markets and so on that with whom we don't have free trade deals or fair trade deals or whatever they're called now. So I think thinking systematically and rigorously through some of the economic concepts that are on and technological concepts that are on the table right now, and giving a kind of strategic purpose to them is why I find this initiative unique and worthy of time and effort.
Thank you. Randy, over to you. What do you think is the important role, important roles of the regional allies and partners like Japan to compete with China?
Well, Japan, as a large economy and large trading partner with both China and the United States, plays an absolutely key role. And our friends in Japan have themselves identified this as one of the pressing challenges of the day. They've created new organization at the national security staff to deal with economic statecraft and really coordinate all those various instruments of national power for Japan. And I think, as Dan was alluding to, when we look at the competition with China, we sometimes we don't even know what the measurement is. How do we know when we're winning? Are we winning if our GDP is simply larger? Are we winning if we're thwarting innovation in particular sectors that are of concern to us? Are we winning if our supply chain is diversified? All of this we can work through and make informed decisions. But in many instances in the past, decisions were made without reflecting upon even those fundamental questions. And I think with Japan, as they themselves work through these things, it's such an important trading partner to both the U.S. and China. Anything we do will be amplified, good or for ill, if Japan is alongside us or not alongside us. That will be one of the defining features as to how we'll be successful. And I think Dan very rightfully pointed out that when we think about economic competition with China, we've got to think about the entire region and even expand how we think of the region, because again, diversifying supply chains is not just imposing cost on China, it's incentivizing our private companies to go elsewhere to better places for manufacturing, for subcomponents and the like. So there's a lot of work to be done on this partner ally piece, and it's absolutely critical. And as I look across the landscape, nobody more critical than Japan, and they've been a thought leader, so we can benefit from what they've learned in terms of best practices, but absolutely going forward in lockstep would be our hope.
Dan, do you have anything to add?
Well, I would, even when you come to Japan, I mean, we tend in Washington, or not to just pick on Washington, I suppose in New York or London, the major newspapers, when they cover Chinese economic issues, they use these kind of crude metrics that gets everybody sort of, there's a risk of losing hope, right? I mean, the Chinese have overtaken, quote unquote, the Japanese. What does that actually mean in terms of wealth? I mean, Japan is far wealthier than China, So again, how to put these things into context for strategists and national security policymakers, is very important. I'd say one more thing. This is tied to allies and partners, and that is weaknesses. We talk about competitive strategy a lot, but we never really focus on how to take advantage of Chinese weaknesses, and there are many, including the fact that we have allies and China doesn't even want allies, right? So, so looking at, and I know the Biden administration and the Pentagon and others are looking deeply more now at what is it that China really isn't succeeding in technologically and industrially, and what is it that the allies can maintain an edge in together, and certainly Japanese technological capabilities, Korean, Taiwanese technological capabilities are far ahead in many metrics of the Chinese, and how do we keep it that way? So again, the allies are incredibly important from a practical standpoint. How can this initiative help guide policymakers who may take up jobs in economic agencies, not just in the United States, but across the allied world, better incentivize their agencies to actually, as Randy says, win, prevail in our contest.
Shioka, I want to invite you back into our conversation. With your background in Japan, Taiwan, Korea, it would be remiss if we didn't get your thoughts on the importance of allies and the roles that they can play.
Yeah, no, thank you. I want to first of all, go back to the comment by Randy about there is this consensus about the China threat, right? There's also this changing nature of what is war. And so we've come half an hour to our conversation. We haven't yet mentioned Ukraine, but I think what we're seeing as the situation in Ukraine continues to evolve is that it has started off as an economic warfare from the Western perspective, and that it has brought together like-minded countries that are equally concerned about the invasion by Russia into Ukraine. And so we are seeing military economic statecraft actually in action, and we're also seeing the limitations of that as well. Can we use that same model? What are some of the lessons learned as we push back against China? I think this is something that we really have to bear in mind. On the Japan front, what is interesting is that Japan is obviously a very critical U.S. ally militarily, economically too, but when we look towards Southeast Asia, Japan is really the bridge builder. And so if we look, for instance, at the latest trade initiative that the United States has launched, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, one of the hallmarks of this, which is still being discussed, is that it has brought in a diverse group of 14 member countries, including the Pacific island of Fiji. But it's also brought in unlikely countries as well, like not just Singapore, but also Vietnam, as well as India. And Japan has played a key role in ensuring that these countries are not just part of networks and alliances and partnerships on the economic front that we really do need. But Japan is offering a listening ear. And I think when we start talking about working together with allies, the United States on a military front is very much used to working on a hub and spoke system where the United States is in the middle. It is the center of force. On the economic front, the United States, the hierarchy is flat. And the United States will have to work together with allies, and it will be leaning far more towards Japan as we look to work more closely with Southeast Asia. And I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the role of the private sector in all of this, that the driving forces of innovation, the driving forces of competitiveness do come a great deal from industrial research that comes from the private sector. And Japan has this great tradition of working closely together with the private sector. And there is a lot for the United States not to emulate Japan with, because some of the experiences that Japan has had, it has obviously not been successful, but it is also a model too for cooperation with the private sector as well.
Thank you. I know that I am thrilled that we have this new initiative with Project 2049, and I know that many audience members are thinking, how can we get engaged with the initiative in the future? What are some ways our audience members can stay engaged with the initiative going forward? I just want to turn it over to you, Dan, to start to see what are some of the things that we can look forward to from the initiative?
I'd say that we have, as Randy said, a very active set of colleagues and commissioners who are already active out in, from my colleague at American Enterprise Institute and University of Texas, Sheena Greitens, who writes a lot and just has a terrific piece out yesterday in Foreign Affairs about how China's responding to the fact that its economy isn't doing so well and has to resort more to expanding its notions of security and political security, ideological security. To Matt Pottinger and Peter Berkowitz and others who Nazak, who have published a lot, who do a lot of things that are already shaping the debate. But I think coming together cohesively with the staff to focus on a set of questions to bring rigor to the discussion, some of the topics of which I raised here today. I think will be very important. So engagement, media engagement, different kinds of different kinds of products that we'll put out, and things of that nature. And substantively, I think that some of the differentiators and ways we want to be a little bit different from other initiatives, substantively, have to do with this question of how do we want to emerge from this competition? How do we want to what does winning it actually look like? What it, not just differentials and economic growth, but how do we create situations whereby U.S. and its close allies in the region are actually on a pathway where they are still the most innovative, where they don't distort their economies so much by trying to copy China that they kill innovation, and these sorts of things, that they put China more on the back foot when it comes to some of the many weaknesses it has economically, that we have an answer to Chinese economic coercion, that to the very good point made about the economic warfare leading up to the Ukraine and during the Ukraine crisis, that the United States and its allies are prepared and can coalesce around a set of tougher economic measures should China ever decide that it was actually going to engage in war against Taiwan or one of our other allies. So I think that's another way people should really look out for these products. I think we're going to look to make a unique contribution on a set of questions that others are looking at, and do as much new public engagement as we see practical.
Randy, do you have anything to add?
Yes, we are also in the market for good ideas. Part of the reason we're convening this group is because some of the answers are not readily apparent. Dan mentioned response to Chinese economic coercion. I've been part of many conversations where different ideas are floated. Maybe we need a multilateral insurance fund to go in and bolster the likes of Lithuania or a small Pacific island when they face Chinese sanction. But that's an imperfect solution for a lot of reasons. The fact that we can, or the possibility we just go in and buy more has its flaws. So, some of these we just haven't solved. And so there are people out there that are thinking about these problems. Feel free to send us good ideas or send us articles, whatever it may be. We're in that market right now, particularly at the beginning phase of this initiative. I think ultimately we do want to have practical solutions. I think Dan concluded by saying we want to think in practical terms, but very much so, how do we take, even when we identify the good ideas, and think about legislation that might be required? How do we, we're a 501c3, so we're not going to be on the front lines lobbying, but we'll certainly be advocating for ideas that are nonpartisan and objective. But ultimately, to have an impact, we want people to be able to pick up the ball, help us take a good idea, put it into legislation, move it into the executive agencies that will have purview over these matters. And the same would be true of our international partners. One of the reasons we wanted to launch this publicly with Ms. Goto is from the start, we're thinking multilateral, we're thinking international as the only effective way to approach this. So as we do our work, we want to be very open to the input of experts and others out there.
Thank you. So I want to draw your attention to CeCe.org. It is CESI.org. That is a place where you can engage with us. Future activities, future publication, events will be posted there. So please come and visit us on CESIonline.org. In addition, there is a contact form there, so send us your ideas. We want to hear from you, and you can email us at project2049@project2049.net. We keep it simple. project2049@project2049.net. I think we have many questions that are coming in from our audience. I want to turn it over to our audience questions. Before I do that, is there anything else you want to add? either Shioko, Dan, Randy, as I transition over? All right. Here we go. We have a question from a student at UT Austin, Emma Haley. It seems like economics has been the missing link of U.S. strategy to compete with China. This has much to do with the fact that the targeted audience for economic competition is outside the Beltway, such as Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and etc. What can CeCe do to reach these hubs of American enterprise? Dan, I'm going to start with you.
Well, it's a great question. I was going to say, part of the reason that economics is there's a couple other reasons, of course, that economics hasn't been as well covered. One is if you talk to economists and you say the words, "What's your economic strategy?" they run away because they say, of course, United States, there's no economic strategy. You have a market, and things are, which we do. We have a great free market system, and we want to keep that. But economists tend to stay away, in my experience, from saying, what's our end state, what's our strategy besides enhanced welfare and so forth. So that's another reason. I'd say it goes beyond Silicon Valley and New York, which is certainly there's concentrated wealth and power there, and there's centers that are not necessarily fully on board with all aspects of competition or see it differently. But the U.S. economic engagement, as far as I understand it, with China and with if we say the Indo-Pacific, Asia, whatever, is so much wider than just those power centers. I mean, we saw in the sort of tariff battles the importance of farmers and farm states. We see the supply chain problems because of COVID-0 and other problems affecting consumers across the country. So I think it's a very important, I guess the way I would answer that is I don't have a specific answer for how to specifically engage, in distributing out to centers beyond the ones you mentioned. But I'd say that, there's a consensus in national security circles about the kinds of problems China poses. There's a bit less of a consensus, and I think we need to address that head on about just how far we want to go on questions of beyond the Beltway, on questions of decoupling and so forth. And then, of course, there's the very difficult questions about trade policy, right? So we used to say 4 or 5 years ago that to get China right, you had to get the rest of Asia right, and that was a mantra for people that were concerned about China. And there was a lot of focus on, again, I go back to, U.S. course, the free trade agreement with Korea and Singapore and better efforts with Taiwan and Australia and so forth, and the TPP. And then after that disappeared, the trade agenda seems to be missing and gone. And again, it certainly affects Americans in certain areas, and that's why politicians are wary of taking on free trade initiatives. But it also benefits many others. So I think we want to take that head on and bring that back to the fore and re-engage that debate, because again, I don't see how you solve some of these China economic or security questions without really catalyzing the kinds of economic reforms in Southeast Asia that we would like to see to provide an alternative, or South Asia to provide an alternative to the China market.
Randy?
Well, I think Ms. Haley's question is a very good one, and it's important to give some thought to why the economic strategy, despite the fact that economists don't like that term, Dan, has lagged behind. And I think sometimes it's important that we approach this with a little bit of humility. I mean, it's the thing about being an American is you're allowed to be ahistorical. You're allowed to think only in current terms. I mean, it took us a long time to recognize the trajectory that China was on and the manipulation of the system that was underway. And so for us to go around and say this country or that country is not getting it right now, we need to have some humility in how long it took us. And when you think about the economic agencies, and I think Dan alluded to this earlier, for decades, or maybe in the case of commerce for over a century, their raison d'etre has been to promote American business abroad, and very much to include China in the last 4 decades. You know, that if you ask somebody, pulled somebody aside in the hallways of one of these agencies and said, "What's your mission today?" You know, they might have said to promote American business interests in China and help our companies grow and help our companies make relationships, enter profitable JVs, and so on and so forth. It's really only recently that we said, wait a minute, we don't have a economic and trade strategy in parallel with our security strategy. We have one that's undermining our security strategy and our military and security interests. That we're enriching and empowering an adversary in some instances in ways that directly benefit their military modernization that's directed at us. So we haven't been at it that long, so I think that explains some of the lag. But look, our private sector is going to be probably the greatest laggard in certain sectors. But you know, ask yourself the question today: Would a company now think about investing in places like Iran or North Korea or Cuba? And well, of course they wouldn't. China is different than those countries, but it is a mindset issue. It is sort of a national security awareness and consciousness that can be created even into the private sector. And I think through some of our public education efforts, the fact that our commissioners are spread across the country, all of this, I think, gives us a fighting chance to move that debate forward in positive ways.
We have a different question from Jacob Parker from the Office of Senator Bill Cassidy. SMIC, the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, has made significant progress in shrinking the size of its chips, recently announcing the 7 millimeter breakthrough. This seems to be a result of removing DUV, deep ultraviolet technologies from the entities list. Considering ASML's pole position in EUV technologies, what would the U.S. do to control critical equipment from contributing to China's civil military fusion? So this is, I mean, sounds like a very technical question, but I think the speaker would like to comment more broadly on the entities, perhaps, entities list, perhaps, and the outlook, America's outlook, ability to control technology that's not perhaps U.S. origined. I'm going to start with you on this, Dan. I think we talked about this several times about the equipment and the critical equipment being protected. So Dan, over to you.
Well, I'll give you a short answer to the question and then a longer kind of answer to the question I want to answer. Since you work for a politician and, you know, great, you know, you probably are familiar with that. So the short answer is yes, of course, removing it from the entities list matters, but the entities lists, and I'd be remiss if I didn't flog a set of papers that are coming out by ex-fellows I had in my technology fellowship I ran through American Enterprise Institute and the Hertog Foundation. It's coming out pretty soon. One by Gregory Graff, who's written about the leakiness of the entities list and the really in detail, and the need to have enshrined in law export controls on things that we know need to be controlled. Why do we know these need to be controlled? Well, okay, SMIC's a perfect example, right? So, you know, the Chinese have spent hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies to build these fabs, right? And still cannot, although you mentioned SMIC's leaps in the size of nanometer of the chip, but generally speaking, you know, have not succeeded in the advanced semiconductor manufacturing space. So one way to have a competitive strategy and to make China continue to have to spend more and more to do something they're not very good at is to have actual export controls, to control those technologies that would actually help them become competitive with a TSMC or with a Samsung or an Intel. And so we need those things, and we need a list of things where China, and one of the things we hope to do in this initiative is come up with more things that China is spending a lot of money on that they're not finding success in. Our mRNA vaccines, that's a big one. China, it's not for lack of trying. It's not for lack of trying for intellectual property theft and so forth. They just haven't been able to do it. And so again, you know, doubling down on things that were, of course, you have to balance that against, you know, general public health policies and aspirations we have for everybody, all of humankind. But again, there are a number of things that China just isn't able to do, and the reason you have export controls and other cost-imposing strategies is to have them keep spending on things that they that they don't succeed in.
Thank you. I think I'm going to go to the next question. We have so many questions. I want to be able to get through them, and I know we only have 10 minutes. We have a question from the live chat, and I know, Randy, you talked about this a little bit, but it's one thing for America to compete economically with China. Smaller countries face realistic risks and benefits in the U.S. China competition. While Taiwan's government helps smaller enterprises with information security and other buffering mechanisms, will the United States be able to closely collaborate with smaller countries to help them wean off, quote unquote, China's money and business?
Well, the short answer is I hope so. We have some tools available. Look, in some instances, it's about simple development needs, and this is an area where our game has not been very strong. We've moved to create new tools like the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, but at this point it's underutilized, and we're still sort of being dominated by the green eye shade types who are out looking for the best deals. But we need to start moving out and act as though we are in a competition. Some cases, it's just simple development needs that will allow them to move along the economic development spectrum to a point where they can have a more diversified trade pattern. But in other instances, it may be outright protection against over-reliance on China, over susceptibility to Chinese coercion. And, in some cases, I think we just take it case by case and look at each country's individual situation. If you're talking about the Pacific Islands, for example, we hold much higher cards among the compact states of Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Republic of Marshall Islands. We got to get the compacts done first, and then we can look at a variety of ways to make them more resilient against potential Chinese coercion. I would point out, however, if you were to look at the last, let's say, 3 decades and look at individual cases where countries came under pressure from China, whether that's Taiwan or South Korea with the THAAD deployment, Australia for having the gall to ask for the WHO to look in the origins of COVID. More recently, Lithuania for having the gall to open a Taiwan representative office. The Chinese bring the coercion. More often than not, countries are resilient enough to withstand it, even small countries. But I would say even more so if we develop the right tools to help them when they're really under the intense pressure that comes with a Chinese overreaction. And those are the kinds of things that I think we'll look to explore in this initiative alongside what other partners can bring to bear. But I'm optimistic, but it's Chinese coercion pressure is a real thing, and we can't sort of wish it away that it's not going to be part of the landscape going forward. So we just need to be smart about how we respond.
Dan, same kind of optimism?
Yes, I am optimistic. Again, the Chinese have certainly gotten our attention with these questions of economic coercion. It's been the Australia case was interesting, right? I mean, so just one quick point here. In terms of Chinese having weaknesses and vulnerabilities too, the Chinese did not go after the things that would have hurt them the most. Australia exports, metals and iron ore and so on. And so we have to start thinking like that too and go on offense, which is there are a host of things that China is dependent upon worldwide. Some of them from the United States, some of them from Taiwan itself. Integrated circuits. So we have to start thinking in those terms as well, and not just always be on the defensive and react.
We had talked about semiconductor industry and so this question is from Wen Xin Cheng from the United Daily News Group. Would you be able to comment on the technological competition with China in the next few years? Are there specific capabilities or sectors that we should be paying attention to? We talked about semiconductor. Are there any ones that you would like to comment on or mention? Randy, I'll start with you.
Well, if I broaden the definition of technology, I think there's some critical sectors, pharmaceuticals, rare earths, where we can't afford to be over reliant. And I think even when you look at the technology space, that what's traditionally defined as the technology space, understanding the various elements of technology research and development, fielding of particular components, and then putting those components, manufacturing those components to final products. Understanding where you are in that value chain and where you want to dominate in that value chain. So there are a lot of discussions about where semiconductors are produced, and that's certainly important. But we also need to think about maintaining our competitive edge, particularly in the research and design phase of the value chain, where America is still strong. But we don't want to sacrifice those edges we have in this competition. That would probably be a lot more costly in the long term, rather than spend a lot of time and effort reshoring or onshoring or friendshoring. I mean, all those can be part of an all of the above strategy. But I think the question about technology competition, we really need to sort of break it down and understand where it's critically important that we maintain an edge, where we need to pick up our game, and where we need to really dominate. And I think, the high cards we hold right now still are on the part of that value chain of design and research in terms of future capabilities. And we can't sacrifice that. And I think Taiwan is a partner in all of that. Obviously, the major foundries are in Taiwan, but the foundries themselves become places of innovation because they're so dominant in the production. So I think Taiwan is going to be an important partner in this going forward. But again, I remain optimistic as long as we are intentional and focused on the nature of this challenge.
Dan?
I didn't have much to add. If you want to go on next questions, or if Ms.
Sure.
Goto, yeah.
Okay, Shioko, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So with the pandemic, as Randy said, the United States and a number of other industrialized countries have identified a number of key sectors, and semiconductors is one of them, pharmaceuticals, higher capacity batteries, rare earths, critical minerals are the four sectors that the United States has outlined. But when we look at the G7 and we look at their G7 infrastructure investment initiative that just came out this summer, they also identify areas where they want to work more and invest more outside of the industrialized countries into the global south and into emerging markets. And some of them include information technology networks, 5G and beyond, 6G, and also environmental sustainability projects too. So to meet some of the energy security needs so that we are less dependent on energy sources from authoritarian regimes. Now, that's not an issue for the United States because it has become a net exporter of energy. But when we turn to the critical allies of the United States, energy security is very much something that continues to rattle them. And we've seen through Ukraine that this is it's a tremendous vulnerability for the global economy as well. And this is going to be a tremendous challenge for Europe as the winter months come. So there are opportunities to invest. There are opportunities that the United States does actually need to work much more closely with other countries as well. I think when we look at opportunities for cooperation, we do need to think about innovation, but not just simply US-led innovation, but innovation together to meet some of these cross-border challenges.
Thank you. An hour is just never enough when we have this amazing panelist here talking to us about this exciting new initiative. I We apologize that we could not get to all of your questions, but this is just the beginning for CeCe. There will be many more activities and events happening, so please tune in to Project 2049's activities going forward. Once again, it's CeCe Online, CESI online.org, for you to stay engaged in the initiative's activities in the future. Shioko, Randy, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.